How JavaScript ruined the web. I saw this video and got so excited that I forgot to hit the sub button. Make sure you give Eric Murphy a subscribe if you like this video. Also, maybe me too, but Eric's the priority here because he made this awesome video about how JS ruined the web that I'm very excited to watch with y'all. And obviously got permission ahead of time too, so this should be fun. Let's learn all about how JS supposedly made the web worse.
Let's talk about the modern web. Everybody kind of knows how bad the modern web is these days, and I'm sure you've experienced it firsthand.
I got so confused for a second that I had opened up developer tools. I was like, wait, what happened here? Huh? Maybe I should have not had this full screen. But yeah, the Reddit, modern Reddit, I should say, is going to be a masterclass of like terrible design. This will be fun.
The web is these days, and I'm sure you've experienced it firsthand because sites like Reddit, which went from being a well-designed, if not a little bit dated website, now it is a slow, buggy monstrosity that loads in megabytes of trackers and lags my browser every time I navigate to it.
Remember you were saying, what about Firefox? I've had Firefox crash way more aggressively than Chrome. It's funny because he was showing Firefox and then showed the Chrome crash page, but yeah.
And the old version of Reddit was perfectly fine, so why did they have to make it almost completely unusable now?
Before he drops his take, I'm going to drop mine because they had engineers that wanted to justify their jobs, and a lot of them pushed to modernize the platform. And since Reddit was a product company that was led by engineering because it was built by engineers, Reddit kept pursuing the engineering angle and leaving product behind, and whatever random product idea they had, they would put way too much engineering force behind. Twitch kind of had the same thing going on, where because Twitch was a company that was built by and largely for engineers, those engineers happened to be gamers, so they could lean in the gaming direction. But from that point forward, most of the engineering effort was things that engineers thought were a good idea, not things that product thought were an important idea. This is a problem I see a lot when the company's product teams aren't the ones leading, even though they're facing users. And you let engineers who are between the infrastructure and the product team be the ones making decisions like this. You end up reinventing things over and over, sometimes making them better, often making them worse, never actually improving the product in the end. I see a lot of people blame product teams for these things, and I've never understood that because an engineer had to make these decisions, and the engineers are the ones that I would blame here.
Even simple informational websites like news websites or recipe sites, they have been so jam-packed with so many scripts that it can take minutes to fully load a simple web page.
Okay, the recipe thing is specific and annoying because recipe sites have a terrible monetization story because they don't have people paying any money. So they make all of their money on ads. But since half of people run ad blockers now, they have to do everything they can to squeeze a cent out of their site. This is why everything now is either paywalled or covered in ads because they have to make some money. But this isn't a modern problem. Do you guys not remember the pop-out era, the toolbars era? Do y'all not remember this era? Was this actually better? Because I agree, like, having too much JavaScript sucks. Having a bunch of ads sucks. This sucks even harder. And like, I've had grandparents with computers that look like this. So that was a real problem back in the day, believe it or not. But yeah, having ads that you're ad blocking out and all the stuff loading on your recipe site feels really bad, but they're trying really hard to make some money. I don't think that it's okay. I don't think that it's good, but I don't think that this is a new problem. I think this is the desperation to monetize free content that has existed for as long as the web has.
And so in this video, I want to go over how this happened. So the simple answer for a lot of this is the web's current obsession with JavaScript.
I have feelings, but we'll see where he goes with it.
Now, of course, there's nothing wrong with JavaScript. People like to dog on JavaScript a lot, but inherently there's nothing really wrong with it. If you want to have any sort of interactivity on your website, you're going to use it. But the problem really arrived with the
WASM not mentioned. What happened to all the Rust in the browser, guys? You're not going to bring that up? Oh, wait. Because to use other engines in the browser and other languages, you probably have to load way more code. Oh, yeah, I guess that the problems that are being brought up here aren't actually solved by WASM. Huh, who would have thought? WASM doesn't solve the problems that people have with JavaScript. Crazy.
Popularity of JavaScript frameworks. So maybe you've heard of React, Angular, Vue, and many, many more frameworks like this. These are basically tools that...
I want to go through that because... First off, what's that TypeScript logo? Where did you even get that TypeScript logo? What the fuck? We have TypeScript at home. TypeScript at home. What? And so these aren't frameworks too. Like, why is Babel in here? Like, Babel's for transpiling JavaScript. Ugh. React's in here twice. Oh, a lot of these are in here twice. Yeah, there's a lot of frameworks. I get it. Even NPM is not a framework. Like, this is interesting. Node is in here separate from JS. RxJS is in here. Yeah, this is an interesting slide.
Many more.
Not to dunk on the creator, to be clear, just quickly done. Potentially indicates a lack of experience in the space. Probably not, though. Just interesting to call these all frameworks.
React, Angular, Vue, and many more frameworks.
There aren't really that many more. There's things built around those three and a few others, but
these are basically tools that web developers use that abstract a lot of things in development away to make it easier to create richer, more dynamic web applications. So basically what I'm saying is these JavaScript frameworks allow for highly interactive web apps with a lot of moving parts.
Okay, I hate to keep dunking on the code, but this example is going to get to me. If you're only using this interface here and you're not exporting it and you're not reusing this definition other places, first off, don't make it an interface. Just use type. It's easier and better to reason about almost always. But also, don't define it at all. Just inline it here. Instead of putting props there, just put the definition. You've added an unnecessary level of indirection that causes people to talk shit on TypeScript that they don't need to. Like, this is much more verbose than it needs to be. I would flip it. I'd have props : this object definition, and then just do props.color, props.onClick, etc. Anyways.
JavaScript frameworks allow for highly...
Chad is saying this is an L take. You prefer the interface on top, you're all wrong. But if you really want to, make it like a rule. But generally speaking, defining unnecessary types is adding unnecessary burden. By having those things separate, you're more likely to make a mistake, you're less likely to notice when an issue occurs, and you have much more indirection in your code base. The only thing that you get out of their way of doing it is the defaulted value, and there's a lot of nice ways to do that differently. Yeah, it's not exported, why put it on top? Yeah, I'm with you on this, Timmy. Yeah, there could be a whole like alignment chart for the different ways people prefer to do this, but yeah, I'm not a big fan of interface on top. That feels like Angular code from like the early 2010s.
The interactive web apps with a lot of moving parts. And that's basically what they're used for, because the most popular React, it was originally developed by Facebook. And that's because it's very hard to have a website with the level of complexity that Facebook has without using a complex JavaScript framework.
Oh, that sentence hurt me a bit. Complexity doesn't scale. This is a thing I think a lot about that arguably deserves a video of its own. The problem with React isn't its complexity, it's its simplicity. React is super, super simple, and that requires you to bring other services in and other solutions and libraries. But the reason that React worked well for Facebook is that its simplicity allowed a team to not adopt more complexity than they need to. If you have a framework that includes everything, then you have a lot of people including a lot of things they don't necessarily need. But if you have a minimal framework like React, you now have the ability for every problem to be as small or as big as it needs to be. I like that React is simple. I think it's one of the best strengths of React. And to say it was invented because they needed a complex framework is a fundamental misread of the existing solutions. Like, React was so simple, people thought it couldn't work because of the way that it did re-rendering being so rudimentary and stupid. But it worked great. The first time you heard about React at the time, it sounded like the dumbest way ever to build things because it seemed like it couldn't perform. But the fact that it did made it a really good solution at scale. But you don't get scale from complexity. You get scale from making things so simple that every addition to your massive thing doesn't have to be massive itself.
That Facebook has without using a complex JavaScript framework.
I will also say flexibility is an important piece too, where there's a level of flexibility you get from tools like React that you don't get from other tools, and especially like all-in-one solutions. Even PHP, which Facebook uses heavily, they had to build a whole new language on top of called Hack.
And so these JavaScript frameworks, they work best as single-page applications. So these are basically websites that you would expect to behave like applications. So for something like an admin dashboard, it makes sense to use one of these frameworks because you're going to be constantly creating and adding and editing things.
Yep. I'll go a step further and say a lot of the new things going on in React with server components probably don't benefit you a lot in this scenario. And if I was building really complex dashboards, I'd be paying a lot more attention to what Tanner's doing with the TanStack and TanStack start stuff, especially the TanStack router. But this is the beauty of React, is that as a solution, it lets you build the right things around it. So if you want a better dashboard experience, you can use React plus TanStack. If you want a better blog experience, you can use Next.js App Router or React combined with something like Astro. The flexibility that some of these frameworks offer you to do the right thing is incredible.
And you don't really want to have the page refresh every time you take an action. That would get really annoying really fast. And so these frameworks work best for websites that have kind of a medium level of interactivity. That's kind of the sweet spot for these JavaScript frameworks, but the problem comes with how widespread the adoption of these JavaScript frameworks was. Now, look, some of these websites, they make sense using something like React, but soon enough, cooking websites were using React, news websites were using React, Reddit's now using React, and none of these websites really need to use React. The front end of these websites doesn't really need to be that complex.
I want to go through those examples again because I don't necessarily agree. Does the cooking website need to use React? No, it's not super interactive. But once you have features like the grocery bag or interactive things on it, parts of it using React make sense. More importantly, though, the thing that you're dealing with the load penalty for is not React or the JavaScript code built around React. It's going to be all these ads and things. In fact, let's find this site. Let's take a look at the network tab. Did a Command-Shift-R, so it's a hard reload. It took a while for this first top level page load to happen. It then loaded, the next thing it loaded was gpt.js. Oh boy. Let's just rip this code quick. What do we got in here? GPT impl plus math.random. Fun. I think this is just for loading iframes and shit. Yeah, this is ad syndication. That's what this is. This is just an ad file. So the first file that takes a while to load here has nothing to do with React. It's just ad stuff. Then we have a polyfill. Then we have a video player, which doesn't matter what framework you're using. That's going to have to come in. Then we have some assets. We have some Webpack stuff. We have the framework, which I'm assuming is whatever framework they're using for this. 40 kilobytes. We got the main here, which is a couple kilobytes as well, 26. We got all of these small pieces here. We got this ad coming in super slowly. But as we scroll more, we see a lot of the bigger things like pub ads implementations, the biggest thing in here by far so far, and that's ads. Obviously, if we sort this by most size, the first thing is this video ad that's playing somewhere. Then we have app code, which is still only 282K. We can pull this over here in format. Most of this is just generic polyfill and function assignment shit, as you would expect in anything actually controlling a web page. So you get the one app bundle here, but a lot of these auto-playing ads are the vast majority of what's going on here. Let's be real. And we have so much other random JavaScript from things that are almost certainly ads. So app nexus shit. We got this web.js file, random service worker shit. But look at this, reCAPTCHA is in here 3 times, and it's the same size as all of the app code. The difference between all of the code for the site and just the CAPTCHA code is negligible. The framework is not the issue here. The framework is one part. The HLS player is another 100-ish kilobytes. This random measurements thing, this banner SDK, all of these things are so much more JavaScript than whatever app code they have. Blaming React for this is, it almost feels like I'm trying to find a good analogy for it. There's no good meme that really represents the gap here. It's you could remove React from this entirely and still have a site that's really slow due to too much JavaScript. If I switch over here, 3.8 megabytes of JavaScript have been transferred. That's unbundled 13.1 megs total. I agree, shipping 13 megabytes of JavaScript is terrible, but I do not agree that React has anything to do with this problem. Just makes no sense to me. It took 1 or 3 minutes to load because I had slow 3G on. If I turn off the throttling and I Command-Shift-R it, still loads reasonably fast, but over 10 megs of JS, I absolutely agree is a problem. But we go to the upload thing site, significantly less. Yeah, so the filtered here is only 8.5 megabytes of JavaScript versus 496 kilobytes. This is a React site. We built upload thing with Next.js and React, and it has a bunch of code, and it's a huge project with a ton of code. But 467 kilobytes versus 8.7 megs, the issue here has nothing to do with React. It feels disingenuous to say such. Hopefully that's not a theme. Hopefully that's a one-off thing.
We're using React. News websites were using React. Reddit's now using React.
Reddit using React, I think, could make a lot of sense. Reddit's supposed to be a very interactive site where you're pressing buttons, you're opening up chats, you're responding to comments, you're doing a lot of things. That type of interfacing and interaction is key to the experience. The one stupid way to measure this is how many button clicks does the average user have per page? If the average button click is a navigation to another page, that's one thing. The average button click is something you're doing on the page, like upvoting or commenting or getting a notification or unfolding something. Those types of things where you want interactions without navigations. Having good client-side experience makes a lot of sense. That said, so much of Reddit is meant to be read, not clicked, that it's a 50-50 case. I could make the argument either way. And if I recall, they're actually working on redoing Reddit yet again, this time using a bunch of crazy web component stuff because they decided React's evil and terrible and the reason we had all these problems. But I still think it's just bad engineering.
And none of these websites really need to use React. The front end of these websites doesn't really need to be that complex. But the reason why React and these other JavaScript frameworks really took the internet by storm is because of how they were marketed. So
okay, we'll see where this goes.
basically, whenever these first came out, they were the next greatest thing in web development. And if you were a web developer back then, I mean, even now, you're basically an idiot if you're not using one of these new frameworks. You're basically...
I'm one of the bigger people who pushes these frameworks, and I would never call you an idiot for not using them. Yeah, I don't love this take. Like, I'll be very clear and explicit here. If you have a framework that isn't a modern framework, if you're like deep in Rails or Laravel or any of these things, and you're using them and you're building things with them, awesome. Keep doing that. You should not feel bad for not using these modern solutions. But if you see things you like in my videos, if you're trying these things out to stay on top of modern development trends and you end up liking some of these things, awesome. I know a bunch of devs who were on more traditional backend, front end, like traditional, I'll say, stacks. Even myself, where I went from Rails and Ruby over to Elixir and Phoenix, over to working on React front ends with a Go backend I hated for a while. And slowly I found myself going back to full stack, where now I'm a pretty big Next proponent, I suppose. But like, use the thing that you know that is working for your problem. And if you want to explore new solutions, cool. I really hope this doesn't go down the all new devs are forced to learn React, therefore all the companies are forced to use React because of that, because that would be a really bad faith argument, because the things people learn are the things that have the most jobs available. We'll see where this goes.
stuck in the past. And if you're still working in something like PHP, people are laughing at you. And these new frameworks aren't even necessarily better than the old way that people were doing things. It's more of just peer pressure because everybody else is doing it. These days, people will ask if they should learn React, one of these JavaScript frameworks, before even learning JavaScript itself.
30% of new devs get started with React. I still think you should learn the basics of JavaScript first, and I will always push that. But yeah, I get why this question hurts if you've been programming for a while. Because like React's a framework. That's not going to last forever. JavaScript is a language that will last forever. Learn your languages, not your frameworks. Yeah, sure. But to think that noobs are the reason that JavaScript's taken over the web is a fundamental misread. And I'm going to go really deep on why in a minute.
And I've been a web developer for a long time. And for a long time, I was just happily making HTML and CSS websites when I was a kid. And then I later moved on to WordPress websites if a client needed it. But I was working on pretty basic websites. But once you start following any web developer influencers, I'm talking about the guys on Twitter who are always talking about the new, latest, greatest technology that everybody needs to be using right now.
If you're not already following me on Twitter, as he's saying, t3.gg on Twitter. I make a lot of bangers. Check me out on there. Worth the follow. Anyways, thanks for the shout out.
Right now. So you would hear these people on Twitter or on a podcast or see a blog post by them. They were always talking about how you need to do things the new and improved way. Or basically you're going to get left behind because this was presented as the future of web development.
I have a video that will hopefully be out by the time this one goes out. Might not be, but hopefully. The topic of the video is that it's overrated to be early. More often than not, being early to something's actually a disadvantage, because if it does succeed, it will change so much before it finds success that it doesn't really matter that you got there early. Like if you got really into mobile dev early, this is the example I love to give, and you got really good at building like crappy Java applets for like flip phones, you might be a god mobile dev. You might be one of the best mobile devs in the world. But then when the iPhone comes out, all of your existing knowledge is useless. So it's not actually good to be early. It's actually okay to be late. Despite it being relatively agreed that I'm one of the like core React influencers nowadays, I only started writing React in 2018, halfway through its life. It was quite popular already by the time I finally decided to give it a chance. And I ended up really liking it. I used it not because some influencer convinced me. I used it because I was almost going to get fired from my job because I was not performing at all. I hated front end. I only did back end. But Twitch is in the process of moving to React, and I saw how much faster the site was. I saw how much better the code was, and I decided I'd give that a shot. I ended up really liking React as a result. But that happened not because some influencer convinced me to use React. It happened because my company was using it. I gave it a shot, ended up really liking it. So yeah, I'm not an influencer in React because I'm in here really early. I'm not an influencer for React because they pay me a whole bunch of money. I'm an influencer for React because I got in late. I loved it. It let me make things I couldn't even imagine before. It turned me into a real full stack dev. And now I get to talk about that with all of y'all. And that's awesome. I love it. But that is like I didn't get there by being really early. And I'll never tell people you need to learn this now or you might fall behind. I push back against that super, super hard. But if you get into it and you happen to like this, awesome. You can go all in. There's enough going on in this ecosystem to keep you busy every day, but you don't need to. You don't have to keep up with this stuff. There's even people who watch my videos specifically because they don't want to keep up. They want to roughly know what's going on without putting the work in, and my channel lets them do that. And I love that. I don't think anyone should feel like they're falling behind if they don't learn all these new things. But if you happen to be excited enough to watch these videos in your spare time, like a lot of y'all are, don't mistake excitement for pressure. These are different things. And if you want to know more about why I think being early is stupid, check out the video either when it drops or now. Editor's note, stick it in here if it's already out. Hopefully it is. So you can go watch that because it's a really good video. Yeah, that's me. I don't front end at all, but I want to be educated about the happenings. To be clear, this is because you want to, Dan, not because you feel like you have to or you're going to fall behind, right? You're here because you want to keep up with these things, not because you have to keep up with these things. Yeah, my boss kind of influenced me there, absolutely. Yeah, Dan, if you disagree with what I just said too, you can say that too. It's totally fine. I do judge people for not using TypeScript. Yeah, if you're using JS and not TS, you fucked up. Yeah, I'm a C++ dev, not in JavaScript at all. I love this. My goal with all of this is to just nerd out about the stuff I like talking about. And I happen to like talking about a lot of this React stuff. Be here because you want to be here. Yeah, here because you want to be. Love that. I love people that use WordPress talking shit about too much JavaScript. The majority of WordPress sites have a lot of JS for doing anything. Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. I'm a WordPress defender. But yeah, it's insane. I want to know about Payload CMS and their approach, even though I never use it. Exactly. I'll be talking a lot more about Payload in the future. They're doing really cool stuff. I hope the Primogen learns from you. He can't stop shilling React constantly. I've never seen anything like it.
And nobody wants to be left behind. And so, of course, that's what I learned. I started getting into React. But soon, people were using React even to build things like static websites.
Okay. I will take a big L here on behalf of the React community. Gatsby was a mistake. Building a blog with GraphQL is probably also a mistake. GraphQL is a really powerful technology for abstracting a backend and a front end when you have a really interactive front end that needs to have a lot of data coming in and out throughout your session. It is not a way to get content for a page. GraphQL is a way for a complex backend and a complex front end to have complex interactions. It's not a way for no backend and minimal front end to be generated. And Gatsby was a weird attempt at taking the patterns and the DX that we love from React and using it to generate a static site with a lot of pain getting there. So I absolutely agree. I do like Ed a lot. This type of tutorial is arguably irresponsible because GraphQL and blogs should be very far away from each other. Back when I was starting my content stuff, a lot of people asked me to take my stack, the T3 stack, and make a boilerplate for it so anyone could get started with it. And I said no. Create T3 app happened as a response to my pushback. My pushback happened specifically because I was concerned people would use my stack, which included an auth layer, a database, an API layer with TRPC, all these things on their blogs. And I didn't want that. If all you need is Next.js to generate the site and Tailwind to style it, you shouldn't be using all of the things that I recommend. You should just use those things. So I didn't make a template because if I did, everyone would use all of these things that don't fit in their stuff. And I agree that is bad. However, Create T3 app was built to prevent that by having you answer which things you want when you actually run it. So it asks you, do you want TypeScript or not? And if you don't choose TypeScript, it'll yell at you, which is the correct option. But everything else here, you pick the packages you do or don't want, and then it gets started. Because you shouldn't have to include all of these things. You shouldn't have a database on your blog. You shouldn't have GraphQL on your static sites. These layers are unnecessary, and if you put them in things like this, you're misleading people into thinking they are. So I am fully with you on this one, Eric. The idea of a GraphQL-based React tutorial to build a blog? Ugh, no.
So I'm talking about a very basic website, maybe a blog, maybe a web page for your dog. And people were so into doing things this new and improved way, the JavaScript framework way, that they came up with this thing called Gatsby. So Gatsby was a really cool static site generator, but
note the use of the word was, because we learned our lessons with this, and we don't do it anymore. Like, Gatsby's dead at this point.
Powered by React. And so you could have a blog or just a simple informational website, but once your website loaded, it hydrated into a fully featured React app. And you get these cool seamless transitions, like you click onto a new page and it doesn't reload the page. It just kind of instantly takes you there. And I remember thinking that this was the coolest thing ever. It was really slick. And so, of course, I built my personal website with this framework. Why wouldn't I?
I want to do a quick poll. Who in chat has built a personal site with Gatsby at some point? Because I know so much of us has. Yes, no, what's Gatsby? Solid 23% have written a site with Gatsby because so many of us got tricked into this in the past. I am guilty as much as anyone. It seemed like a good idea at the time until you understood what it was actually doing and the concept of hydration actually clicked. Ugh, yeah. Gatsby had a couple good ideas and a bunch of really bad ones, and the mess of attaching them all together resulted in a disaster that Netlify had to come in and clean up. Anyways.
But then after I finished with it, it felt a little bit weird because my website was loading slower than before. So at the time, the slogan for this framework, the slogan was, it was fast in every way that matters.
Gatsby, Gatsby, Gatsby.
And it definitely felt very slick, but very slow. Because when you first try this, it does feel a little bit faster because, like I said, it doesn't have to reload the page in order to get new data. But the initial page load of loading my website in for the first time was noticeably much slower. That's because it had to load in all of this JavaScript and parse all of it before it even displayed any HTML. And of course, parsing hundreds of kilobytes of JavaScript takes much longer than parsing maybe 100 kilobytes of CSS or HTML.
This part's very disingenuous in contrast to the examples earlier, where earlier examples with React sites were slow because they were covered in ads and other random shit. Gatsby sites are slow because Gatsby's architecture is an absolute nightmare. Their way of handling hydration and loading the JavaScript in was a thing out of a horror film. And the interactivity being a thing that happens later is kind of what we want. Ideally, we want our HTML to come down with the right content in it. We want our JavaScript to come in when it's ready, ideally before we click a button. And we want the user to have all of this happen without their device overheating and using a ton of bandwidth. And the modern React solutions now do all of these things relatively well. With Next.js, you can generate the static HTML, you can hydrate the minimal set of JavaScript that you need, and then you can start navigating the site. But all of the benefits you mentioned before are real. You can even go to very single-page app-heavy things like, are you guys familiar with Docusaurus? Because I will continuously defend Docusaurus. I still think it's one of the best docs options. This site flies. Do you see how fast when I click things, they just open immediately? As a docs site, it's awesome. It's really good. Hell, one of the creators, core contributors, I don't know what your role is nowadays, Sebastian, with Docusaurus, but pretty much run it nowadays. Like, one of my biggest regrets was moving off of it because I had no reason to. It's phenomenal software, but like, it's a single page app. If we look at the JavaScript bundle here, this is running React and looks like it's running quite a bit of it. We have a lot of JS in here, but it's still way less than any of the other sites we looked at, but it flies. And if we compare this to Create T3 app, which we built these docs using Astro, I'm clicking now. I'm clicking now. I'm clicking now. And I am on a super low latency gigabit connection. If I was to hop in here and add, I don't know, slow 3G throttling, now let's navigate to a page. Waiting. Okay, cool. Now we're on the page. Let's go do the same thing with the same throttling over here. So again, this is bad network conditions. This should be way worse, right? Tell me why it's instant. The reason is once that JavaScript loads, you don't have to wait for the server to respond with more shit. Does it load a little too much stuff initially? Yeah, it can. But the fact that these things load this much faster, or when I click, I get a loading state immediately, and then the rest loads in after, those are things that are significantly harder to do with traditional static pages. It benefits a ton. Like, you get objective wins and performance wins too, not just UX wins. There are performance benefits of building a single page app, even if it's static content like your docs. It actually feels better to navigate a Docusaurus page than it does to navigate something using something like Astro. This isn't to talk shit on Astro. I think it's a phenomenal framework. It's what we use here for reasons, what I use on my home site as well and my blog too, because I want static content. And it is a great static content framework. But if you are navigating heavily, you're clicking a lot, you're going around a lot, the benefits of single page app technology are real. And I'm not saying that there aren't single page apps that are slow. I'm saying that they're usually slow for different reasons.
And so after I built this was my first inclination into realizing that something might be wrong with modern web development. Why am I building this simple website which should just be HTML and CSS? Why does this need React?
Yeah, I agree. Gatsby encouraged us to stuff React in a bunch of places without good guidance or reasons. It was rough, and we've learned our lesson since. But I absolutely agree. We went too far. But I feel like we're complaining about where React was in 2018 instead of where it is today. Also, Docusaurus V1 was a multi-page app. Docusaurus makes it easy to maintain open source documentation websites. Yeah. Again, like, Docusaurus used to be multi-page, so every page was its own static HTML, and they moved away from that at some point because it wasn't great. Here I have fast internet, but if I go back to turning that down again, we'll see that even Docusaurus old versions had this problem. Slow 3G. See how long these pages take to open now? That's the issue. And that's why they moved off it, because after building like this for Docusource, they learned the single page app approach actually made a better experience. As long as they still had HTML that was generated, everything else worked pretty well. Yeah. As Sebastian said here, it was using React only on the server, no hydration. V2 does not improve Lighthouse scores, yet it feels faster. Yes. Thank you for back to the Lighthouse point, because I missed that. Lighthouse scores do not measure how good a website performs. They're incredibly easy to game. The one thing that Gatsby said earlier that I actually kind of agreed with, I'll skip back to the tweet because it is a good tweet. The fastest site in the world is an empty index.html, and it's all downhill from there. That is actually kind of a banger take, because if you delete all of the content and make your site nothing, you'll have a great Lighthouse score. If you hide all of the content until Lighthouse finishes scoring and then you load it in after, if you suppress all of the ads or you run an ad block when you run Lighthouse, all of these things can make your Lighthouse score look great. But if you don't actually deeply know what Lighthouse is measuring, you should not be using it as a reason to pick technologies. Lighthouse is a very specific metric that is almost never used correctly when I see people talking about it anymore. Anyways, but yes, I agree. Gatsby was a step down the wrong path, and I'm really happy we didn't go further with it, because that could have ruined the web. And Gatsby absolutely could have been a really rough path, because most people should not have been using it. And this claim of generating 100,000 pages, no. Gatsby got so slow so fast once he generated more shit. They could not handle that.
Of course, this is a very extreme example, building a completely static website with React, but it just left me with kind of a bad taste in my mouth. Like, really? This is supposed to be the future of web development? Not to mention that the process of building this website caused so many headaches. So I was building my website with Gatsby version 1, but in tech these days, people like to move fast and break things. And so while I was working on this project, they upgraded to version 2 of Gatsby, and switching to it was a major headache because there were so many incompatibilities between the two versions.
Is this motherfucker saying that updating is hard when he's running Linux? This isn't real, right? Has anybody here successfully done a major version update on any major Linux distro ever? Because if so, you're lying, but I want to see you lie in chat. But as someone who used to rock Ubuntu 12.04 and rocked Ubuntu 12.04 until 16.04, because good luck upgrading Ubuntu. What do I consider major on Arch? That great question. Ask them. It's gotten better since. Okay, that's good to hear. I upgraded Ubuntu once, then went to Arch. It literally broke my PC. So you just upgrade. Like, you didn't change anything. All your old programs worked. All your old folders and everything, your drivers just worked. You just updated the Ubuntu version. You didn't do a fresh install. You just bumped it, right? Had to migrate for a 16.04 install to 22.04. It took a week to make things work normally again. Yeah, this is the experience I expect with Linux. I guess if you have a brand new install with almost nothing going on, maybe a version bump might be easy. But as soon as you're actually using Ubuntu, good luck. Like, seriously. I haven't. So with a bump update, sure, but a major. It's just, apps being containerized on Linux is a nice thing to hear about. And Ubuntu server is different too, because you're not using anywhere near as much stuff. But like, as soon as you have a desktop environment that has anything custom based on your current distribution or configuration, like I never had my trackpad work properly after a Linux update in my entire life of using Linux, which I was a pretty diehard Linux guy for 4 or 5 years. I just never had a good experience doing updates. So to me, this feels funny, because like, I've also bumped projects React versions and had a ton of issues, but also bumped projects React versions and had 0 issues. I'm sure Gatsby was a miserable problem, and I fully sympathize here. Having done Webpack bumps myself from like Webpack 2 to 4, hell, actual hell. So I could sympathize here, but it's kind of funny to complain about version bumps breaking things by showing a terminal of a version bump inside of a custom Linux DE. Okay, thank you, Lynn. I thought I was being fucking gaslit here. Liars in here with the Wayland change. You didn't have 16 to 22 to 24 successfully. Absolutely. Wayland is, yes, you're all fucking lying. Thank you, Lynn, for confirming that I'm not going insane. Whew, anyways.
I essentially had to completely rewrite my website. And this is just kind of the feel of working with these modern web frameworks.
Yeah, this sucks. I'm not going to say it doesn't. I think it's funny he's doing this in Linux, but having a major version bump force you to basically rewrite everything is a terrible feeling. And the fact that things like Gatsby broke a lot was a problem. And it didn't really feel very React-y, because historically React has gotten major version bumps without issues. Like, you can take code from a React project from 2012, 2013, and stuff it in an existing React project today, and you can server render a class component that's 10 years old. That's awesome. React's backwards compatibility is, for the most part, nuts. But yes, some of these new early tools around it aren't great. And I agree, we shouldn't be telling people to move everything to a brand new tool or solution. Ideally, it's been around for a few years, has proven that it doesn't break with majors, and that they're here for a while maintaining a project that you can actually rely on. Like, I don't know, React or Next or Angular or Svelte and SvelteKit or any of these tools that have been around for a bit now that are not going anywhere, that have clear funding, clear path, clear way for their developers to use them and consume them over time. Gatsby was an early bet, and a lot of people made a bad bet there. And if I was an influencer at the time, I probably would have recommended Gatsby, and that would have been a mistake of mine. I would have had to walk it back. Thankfully, I never pushed Gatsby because I learned about it late enough that it seemed obviously dumb to me. And then when I discovered the power of Next.js, I ignored it because I was using Vite still. But eventually, I found my journey over to Next.js. But like, yeah, this sucks. I agree. This feeling is terrible. I would be very mad too. But I don't think it's fair to say the whole ecosystem is bad because you made an early bet on something that broke. And also, by the way, major versions are where things are supposed to break anyways. So if they want to improve things, that has to happen. Should they just not improve things? Like, what's the solution here? I digress.
Everything's always changing, and you constantly need to be on top of things. And if you're migrating to a new version, things are just going to break. You're just going to have to rewrite things and fix things, because there's so many moving parts in your website that you need to pull in all of these dependencies from all different kinds of people. So even just a basic hello world.
I have to pull all these dependencies from all these other people. You're using Linux. This meme is about you. I'll hand a freebie out. Let's give a theoretical how I would take down JavaScript if it was in my interest to. Expecting this level of technical understanding of every single piece in the system makes a lot of sense for Linux contributors, but we don't seem to be doing that as much in the JavaScript world. We've almost encouraged people to not understand these dependencies and instead live in these abstracted layers. As such, the modular way of building works well for Linux, but doesn't for JavaScript. I just gave the argument none of them ever have, which could actually be a decent argument, an interesting conversation. But since none of them have ever given it, I'm just going to throw that away because we can't have the conversation until you make a real argument, not using a modular thing, complaining about a different modular thing. And I haven't even gotten into the fact that the only reason you have apps on your computer right now as a Linux user is because of Electron, which is a JavaScript thing, because you would not be able to use Linux for your job if it wasn't for the fact that Electron means the web version of Slack is great and you have a desktop version too. It means the Discord web version is great and you have a desktop version too. It means all of these tools, even VS Code that we rely on every day, can actually exist on Linux. Point being, JavaScript has copied the philosophy from the Unix and Linux world, and it's also allowed for better applications to exist in the Linux and Unix world. It feels bad faith to say all of these dependencies are evil and bad as you're installing them on an operating system with even more dependencies from even more esoteric people that have crazy exploits like XZ happening. Like, what's the don't throw stones in glass houses thing? Like, yeah, the problem you're describing is a problem in the operating system you're currently using.
Example these days, at least for Gatsby, this framework I was working in at the time, it brings in like 1,000 packages, and all of these packages add up to hundreds of megabytes just to create this very basic hello world example. It's really ridiculous. And
I can't get this number easily. How many gigabytes of stuff do you need to compile the Linux kernel? If you were trying to compile the Linux kernel, how much stuff do I have to download to do that? Not much? That's cool to hear, actually. Only GCC in the kernel code. Okay, that's cool. Okay, so binutils plus GCC, that's 250 megs. Okay, so 250 megs to compile Linux. Is it kind of funny that you need double this to compile a website? Sure. But the thing that gets output at the end isn't that size. Funny enough, we could probably make that bundle a lot smaller if we axe all the binaries that aren't JavaScript from it. Like the next binary's gotten huge. And a lot of why the next binary's gotten huge is because they're writing parts of it in Rust now, and they have to bundle the Rust binary for every different platform. So when you install the next package, it's coming with all of these things for building and bundling that happen to not be written in JavaScript. So now the binary size is huge. The worst thing that's happened to node modules in terms of the size of the node module folder is using languages that aren't JavaScript, that need a binary, that are faster and better. Those end up taking up even more space. So a problem being presented without presenting solutions, where all the solutions are going to make things worse. So he's not talking about, that's actually a good question. Is he talking about the O on the server or JS in general? He's talking about JS in general, but what he's talking about when he says that number 500 megs is on your machine during dev or your CI during build. You don't need the 200, 500 megabytes almost any other time, just building and bundling. And then once you have an output, that ends up being way smaller. The tools and the size of the tools to build something are fundamentally different from the tools and the size of the tools that you export at the end.
You can imagine what happens when websites are so complex, they really become fragile. And a lot of these projects, if you come back a year or two later and you try to download them again and edit something with it, it literally doesn't work because everything has changed. Like the Node.js version has changed. And so it's no longer compatible with all of these old libraries.
This is how I feel using Linux, to be fair. But on the other hand, this is a fair critique. I'm going to go bump a major version on an old-ass Next project soon because I want some of the new features in the new Next versions. It's going to break things. It will be worth it in the end, but it's going to be a fun journey. And I'm excited to see what breaks and what doesn't. I somewhat recently bumped another project and it wasn't too bad. That said, if I can't bump it and I just have to go and use the old version of Next, it's like 3 or 4 years old now, that's fine. I've been contributing to that code base with a 4-year-old version of Next for a while, and it's not causing any problems. It's still super nice to work with, still a great developer experience. It's sad that when you go back to one of these old projects, if you don't have like the right version of Yarn or Node or any of these things, that like stuff gets way worse to work with. But there's a lot of work going on to solve this. Things like CorePack, which will use the exact version of the package manager that your project or your package JSON specifies. Things like the package lock, which it's embarrassing we didn't have before, but now we have a lock file that says these are the exact versions of everything. Makes it way easier to go to an old project and have it still work. Things like all the work that Next has done into bundling Next's dependencies into a single binary. When you install Next, you're not installing its 400 dependencies. Those are all bundled into one thing. So the version of Next implies the specific versions of all the other things too. So you don't have to worry about all of those subdependencies. It just makes so much more sense. It took us a bit to find these solutions, but how long has it taken us to figure out how to do a DE in Linux, much less a package manager?
And so it's no longer compatible with all of these old libraries. And if you upgrade some of these libraries, then they're incompatible with other libraries. It's really a major headache working with all of these frameworks because there are so many moving parts.
You download the project to follow an older tutorial, run npm install, and spend the next 2 days doing crazy movements trying to resolve the project dependency conflicts. Do you know what a package lock is? Somebody watching might not actually know this, so we're going to go to a real code base and take a look at what a package lock is. What code base is this? Okay, this is something I was working on for a prototype of a hosted version of Upload thing. And in here, we see your dependencies. Fastify, multipart, Hano node, just all the different things I was testing with. But this isn't the file that's interesting when it comes to long-term support. If this was all you had and you went and installed, there's a decent chance things will break. They're even more likely if you do something like this. Like I put latest here, and somebody comes to try and run this code 4 to 5 years later, yeah, that sucks. Thankfully, no one ever recommends doing that ever for any reason at all. We all have lock files that specify this is this exact version, this is this exact version, this is this exact version. Because of that, when you run pnpm install, you'll get the exact versions of these things, even if you're doing this years later. Did it suck that we didn't have this day one? Sure. Python still doesn't have it. A lot of languages don't have good solutions for lock files still. We added it late, sure. We didn't add it that late. It's been a standard for at least 10 years now. It's just kind of funny to me to think that this is still a problem. If anything, I would make a counter argument, which is that if you download an older project or tutorial, you run the npm install, and then you spend the next 2 days doing these crazy things, there's a good chance that tutorial sucks. Because if you're looking at a tutorial that doesn't have lock files, you're looking at a bad tutorial. I wish they would just take them down. But that's why the same educators you were bitching about earlier are so valuable, because they're making new up-to-date materials that better represent the current reality, and they're more tuned in with these things, so they have better examples to start with in the first place. So these 2 points feel like contradictions. And on top of that, we've largely solved this problem. Okay, apparently Python has finally solved this problem. That's good to hear. Let me know when they have types working.
But with everything I've told you, you might now be wondering why anybody would want to use one of these complex frameworks. Like, it might make sense if you have a complex web application that has a lot of interactivity, but most websites using these bloated frameworks don't meet these descriptions at all. But one big reason why a lot of people use these frameworks is the so-called developer experience. So this is kind of a marketing term that a lot of these frameworks throw out. And so what this essentially is it's the most fun technology for developers to use. That's really what the developer experience boils down to. Because when you use one of these frameworks, it does a lot of nice things for you. Like I said, it does things like minify your JavaScript, minify your CSS. These days with every framework, you can have hot reloading, so you make one change to the website in development, and it...
Who has recently played with a thing that doesn't have hot reloading? Okay, thank you, chat, for making me feel less insane here, because I always keep my mouth shut. Last 30 seconds are going to make my brain explode. Marketing term, yeah. I challenge for the audience. Imagine if instead of frameworks in React, he was talking about Vim here. Just replace the word React and frameworks with Vim and editor and see how this feels.
Frameworks don't meet these descriptions at all. But one big reason why a lot of people use these frameworks
Reason why people use Vim
is the so-called developer experience. So this is kind of a marketing term that a lot of these frameworks throw out.
a lot of these Vim users throw out.
And so what this essentially is it's the most fun technology for developers to use. That's really what the developer experience boils down to. Because when you use one of these frameworks, it does a lot of nice things for you. Like I said, it does things like minify your JavaScript.
See my point? We like developer experience in some places, but not others. We don't like developer experience, but we don't like the technology. Saying minification is a DX thing and not like an essential thing for providing a good experience for your users is kind of insane. He was winning me over, but this part in particular feels like big React marketing push bad, like React evil, ruining web. Ugh.
It does a lot of nice things for you. Like I said, it does things like minify your JavaScript, minify your CSS. These days with every framework, you can have hot reloading, so you make one change to the website in development and it instantly updates.
Does Laravel have hot reloading, by the way? I haven't used it enough to know. Because I feel like a lot of the old solutions, especially back when I was using Rails and stuff, even when I was using like Elixir Phoenix stuff, hot reloading was not a thing and it drove me mad. Okay, cool. So apparently if you use Laravel with a JavaScript ecosystem thing, Vite, you can have that. So I have this page, logos 3000, hello world. I'm gonna go to my editor. I'm gonna change this to hello, please subscribe. Why isn't it changing? I saved the file. Oh, because I have to refresh. There's a whole generation of developers who don't realize you have to do that because they're so used to the fact that most tools have this built in now. It's crazy to me to think that anyone would live without this and then use it as like a, wow, that's the only reason people use no, this is this is table stakes for me. No hot reloading means I'm not interested in your thing. Even back when Remix didn't have hot reloading, I gave them a ton of shit for that. Like, hot reloading is just kind of essential to modern dev, especially when you're doing like picky style stuff. Like once you're trying to get an element like aligned in the right place, not having to save, go back, refresh, wait, then see it. Whew, insanity. It's just, hot reloading is a huge win, and people don't appreciate the fact that React kind of normalized that being a thing.
While you're working on it, and if you had been like me and been making websites the old way for a decade before, then the first time you use a JavaScript framework, it seems almost magical. You can easily import snippets and libraries from millions of NPM packages with a simple terminal command. And the idea is that if you make things easier for developers, then it's going to kind of trickle down into a better user experience.
No, that was never what was implied. The point of making developer experience better is that smaller teams of developers can get more done more efficiently. The alternative to a website in React isn't a website in some better technology. Almost always, the alternative to a website in React is no website. What React and technologies like it have enabled is for more people to make more things more effectively, similar to Electron. The alternative to an Electron app isn't a desktop app, because that app's going to take 4 times more devs, 10 times more time per platform to make, versus the Electron app, which sure might not be as fast or as good or look as nice when you open up your activity monitor to see how much memory it's using. But the alternative isn't a better app. The alternative is it doesn't exist. Our ability to make a thing that people want, to adjust the thing over time, to work with our users to improve things based on what they're doing and what they need, that's the win. You're able to do so much more when your technology lets you move faster. It doesn't mean that your website's magically going to perform twice as good, and anybody selling that promise is a liar. But when the technologies get better, it allows us to move faster and in better directions. The reason Gatsby was exciting isn't because it's going to make your blog super fast. It's because you could build your blog using the same things you learned to use at work on your apps. And if we have certain technologies that we can reuse in multiple places, it makes developers more efficient. And the word efficiency has not been said once in this video for a reason, because there's no conversation about how effective a developer is at contributing. I think having more websites by more developers is good. I think a developer being able to build a thing in 3 months instead of 2 years is good. I think a developer being able to build actual websites like a Twitter clone in their first year of programming is good.
If we can develop new features faster, of course that will make everything better for the users, right? Not only that, but working in decades-old technology is boring, and the newest framework trending on Twitter is much more appealing than using what you always have.
Why is it more appealing, though? Is it more appealing because it's newer, or is it more appealing because the people who made it used the thing that you like more, learned things from it, and decided to implement some of them and not implement others.
It can also be fun to imagine yourself using the cutting edge technology that a startup would be using. Like maybe you got a job at the New York Times, an old dusty newspaper, but you wish you were working at Twitter.
Motherfucker, this is the funniest example he has given. He just gave New York Times as an example of a musty old company using old tech, and you want to make something new. History of Svelte. By the way, if you're not familiar with Svelte, it's the framework that's meant to be the alternative to React, built by somebody who loved React but wanted something faster, more HTML friendly, more dynamic as well. Harris, the graphics editor at the New York Times, had a sense of responsibility for building a framework that was too JavaScript heavy and did too much work. He also believed that compilers could improve the user experience. So the most bleeding edge thing, so bleeding edge it'd even make it into your video, was made at the company that you gave the example of being an out-of-date old company. So much of these modern tools and technologies come from huge companies running into huge problems. TypeScript exists because Microsoft wanted to use more JavaScript, realized that the way we built JavaScript wasn't scaling, so their solution here was to fix it by making TypeScript. So many of these solutions come from these big companies, and it says so much that the example used of New York Times being boring is also where the framework came from for Svelte, which is even newer and more bleeding edge and has way more breaking changes.
So you use all of the cool new technology that they use. And so if all of these tools are making the developers more efficient, what's wrong with that?
I will also say that a lot of the startups I've seen and talked to are using hilariously out-of-date or wrong technologies because all of them want to be Facebook or Google or one of these big companies. The number of 3-person startups I've seen deep in Kubernetes with like 10 users is hilarious. And I have to dig them out and be like, hey, look, there's this thing called serverless. It means that you don't need to have 3 sysops people when you're a 3-person company. Wouldn't it be nice if you had less sysops engineers than you had users? Ugh. Yeah, no, it's just like... It's funny, like, I don't want to dig on the creator of this video too much because he made a great video. He's very good at editing and structuring and telling a story and getting riled up. Like, I don't get this riled up on a bad video. It's clearly a good video. It's getting me feeling things. But man, this part in particular speaks a lot on how much time has been spent talking to these companies and talking to the engineers from these companies, because this isn't reality. Startups are cosplaying as huge companies, and huge companies are inventing new technologies because they're moving too slow. So a lot of these modern solutions we're bitching about, things like React and Svelte, came from big companies. And the things that we're saying are better alternatives that startups should be using and aren't are killing the startups because they're trying to copy what they think Google or Facebook is doing.
Of course, all of this comes at a cost, and probably the biggest cost is performance. And I'm sure you've heard that if your website is slow, then you're probably going to lose business. Because if you're a customer that's going to your website for the first time and it's very slow to load and very laggy, of course, people aren't going to stay on your website for very long.
One thing I want to point out here, what do you notice about this website being slow? Because there's something very obvious that I notice about it being slow, and it has nothing to do with JavaScript or interactions or the dev experience or any of these things. The site is slow because of the images. I'll go a step further and say if you're using tools like Next, having your images load better is somewhat easy because you can use the image component. And the image component is a smart JavaScript component that can run on server and client, and based on the width and height properties you give it, generate on the server the smallest possible image that client can use. So instead of having a bunch of those giant like JPEGs that I'm sure was what's being used on there, they can have minimal WebPs on the platforms that support them. And it's as easy as switching from lowercase image img to uppercase image image inside of a Next project. And now you have the ability to optimize any image that your site serves. So cool. And the fact that these technologies are being blamed when they're the only ones that actually care about these problems is telling to me. Because if you built this site in Laravel, if you built this site in Rails, you built this site as static HTML, it's still gonna take forever for the images to load. Like, what?
These kinds of performance regressions aren't really felt until much later, until it's actively hurting the business. Because whenever you first use these frameworks, they feel pretty fast, until you have to load in all of the dependencies and all of the ads and trackers that are also required on your website. And after you add in everything, it really slows the website to a crawl. But let's also talk about who this affects, because let's face it, a lot of developers are using M1 MacBook Pro with 16 gigabytes of RAM. So that's on the developer side of things. These are the people in Silicon Valley, California, and they're using top-of-the-line equipment with blazing fast internet connections in developed countries. But of course, this affects people using rural connections, and
I totally agree with this point. I wish more of us spent more time with our slow settings with like slow 3G in the network side. It's also why I think VPNs for dev are really nice too. Like VPN yourself somewhere far away, lower your like Chrome speeds down to slow 3G, so you're eating the terrible latency and the terrible like performance in a different region, and also the terrible bandwidth, and see what your site is like. Also, CPU throttling is a really good idea too. When I was doing more mobile dev, especially React Native stuff, I had a crappy Android phone that was 4 years old at the time, and this was 4 years ago. And it sucked to use. And I would test not just the optimized production builds, but the dev builds too, in order to make sure this worked and that they had an even close to decent experience. It's important. But again, the alternative to a React site isn't a perfectly implemented and optimized fast site. It's almost always no site. I remember back when the peak of COVID hit, there was a site that LA made as a quick little site to see what the current like COVID numbers looked like in LA. And the site performed terribly. And immediately a bunch of the anti-React people came on Twitter like, oh my God, look, see how terrible React is for making a website like this slow? Like this is a health essential site and it's so slow. Then Ken Wheeler did a quick bundle analysis, and it turned out the site was slow because it was loading 5 megabytes of JSON. It had nothing to do with the JavaScript code. It was just the huge JSON. On top of that, if they hadn't used React and they used other technologies for it, they would have had to hire people to do it. They would have had to make a bunch of decisions around what technologies to use, where to use them, why to use them, how to maintain them, all that shit, and then update the website via some server doing it for you every however long. Or they could build a quick little React app, load the data, and show it to you. The alternative to that COVID site isn't they hired a bunch of people on a city level to build them the perfect site for this COVID thing that would come out 3 months later than it should. The alternative was no site. And the fact that they got a COVID site out within days of COVID starting, and it was almost certainly just one dev quickly built it and fetched the JSON from the one place you could get it, that's a good thing. The fact that there are 10 times more websites being built right now is good. If we 10x the number of things on the internet, the number of bad things is going to go up too. So let's say this is the case. Half of PHP sites are good, half of PHP sites are bad. And with JavaScript, half are good, half are bad. Here's the reality though. One of these bubbles is not this small. Now we're a little closer to reality. So even if the ratio of good to bad sites is the same between PHP and JavaScript, just by 10xing the number of websites, you're going to find a lot of bad JavaScript sites. And if your goal is to show how many bad JS sites there are, cool. It's easy to do because there's a shitload more websites than there used to be. And even if the percentage is exactly the same of good to bad between old and new, even if it's way smaller, even if it's like 1% on both, if it's just like a tiny little chunk here, there are now more bad JavaScript sites than there are total PHP sites. So yeah, that's going to look and feel bad. I agree. But to pretend that JavaScript is the reason these sites are bad and not bad developers, bad deadlines, bad process, that's dishonest. It doesn't matter how bad Gatsby was because as a community, we moved on and WordPress is still a miserable shit show within here. So like, yes, when the number of websites has gone up exponentially, there are going to be more bad sites. I agree. But like everybody pretends like we should fix this by making all sites good. That's not possible. The way you fix this is by eviscerating half of the websites on the internet. Like if I do this, look at that. All of JavaScript websites are good now. But we do that by deleting a huge chunk of the web. It's not like these things magically get remade properly. Nothing will ever do that. That's not how this works. The problem here is purely one of scale. And a good point in chat, if we had just deleted this way, both Twitch and Facebook would never have made it as far as they have. The scale is not perfect. I just opened up Excalidraw. I'm sorry I don't have the exact ratios in my head.
And those in developing countries, they don't always have the fastest internet. Not to mention that, but a lot of people are using older devices with 4 gigabytes of RAM or less.
One more thing on the rural places. I can't miss out on the opportunity to talk shit on Flutter, right? Did they really put a gambling thing on? That's hilarious. But yeah. Fun fact about Flutter, other than the fact that their site's navigation is hilarious. Like, how is this that bad? I'm not even zoomed in or anything. Anyways, the reason I bring up Flutter is because Flutter has a chokehold on the African software market right now. Like the majority of new Flutter apps being deployed are in a place that is mobile first and dominant. Like there's very little computer penetration at all. It is very low reliable bandwidth and latency. And despite all of that, Flutter is still being recommended and used heavily. A Flutter Hello World, and I can open this up, right? Awesome. Notice how long this is taking to load. Let's go to the network tab quick. Let's see how much 7.2 megabytes transferred. The technology that is being recommended by a lot of the anti-JS people is Flutter. It's being used heavily in the regions that we were just discussing, places like Africa. It is very heavily used in Africa. The Flutter SDK alone is 5 megabytes. The Dart SDK on top is another 2. You're joking, right? 58.6 megabytes of resources for a hello world with a counter. Why are we complaining about React when people are sincerely recommending this? Not just for mobile, because if they're just recommending it for mobile, still stupid, whatever. Flutter for web is like the pinnacle of all of the things you're complaining about. It is the peak golden goose example of the exact issue you're describing here in this video. However, still being used in the regions you're describing. And this is where things get really interesting, because the intuition here seems really true, which is that there are people in these places with slow internet. I also just realized it's kind of a questionable caricature, but in the picture I'm saying specifically, but that aside, the people in the regions that you're discussing here who have really slow internet and are using their phones, going to these websites, a lot of the devs there are using Flutter, and they're using Flutter for web. Like, there are banks built in Flutter for web for Africa, and people just use them, which is just insane. Like, actually insane that people recommend these solutions. But the reality is, once it's slow, it's always slow. So the difference between 10 seconds and 30 doesn't feel as bad as the difference between 100 milliseconds and 500 milliseconds. And that's, it's funny because he's saying the MacBook privilege, we don't see slow, but then go to these regions, it's going to be slow. Those regions are using the slowest possible solutions right now. So it just isn't an honest point if you know anything about these markets. I agree, we should be working to make things faster for these regions and for these specific instances, but the existing solutions, the things that they're using, are even worse.
Not to mention that, but a lot of people are using older devices with 4 gigabytes of RAM or less. And this noticeably affects how long the page loads because, again, it has to parse all of the JavaScript. That takes computing power. And this becomes even worse on phones because, let's face it, a lot of people, most people these days use the internet on their phone.
So I have to go back to the earlier point with the JavaScript takes a while to load. That's almost all of the JS. We saw a page that had 5+ megabytes of JS and 200 kilobytes were coming from React. The rest was all ad stuff. And I agree that sucks. The enshittification of the web via these crazy ad and tracking platforms with all of these crazy packages, these massive images not being optimized, all these things suck. Legitimately. They legitimately are terrible. And you'll never convince me out of that. But that's not React. That has nothing to do with React. Go back to the old web. We had a ton of shitty pop-ups and viruses and all these things, and the sites loaded like shit then too.
The JavaScript, that takes computing power. And this becomes even worse on phones because, let's face it, a lot of people, most people these days use the internet on their phone. And these websites just drain your battery like no tomorrow. Have you ever navigated to one of these websites on your phone and just literally watched as your battery drops before your very eyes?
You know what? I'm going to do a test, and we're going to include something at the end of the stream. My phone is on right now. It has 85% battery. I'm going to turn the brightness down all the way. I'm going to turn on the settings so that my screen doesn't go to sleep. Auto lock, never. I'm going to go to a random React site. I'll go to upload thing. So I'm now on the upload thing homepage on my phone, and I'm going to leave this for 30 minutes. You know what? I'll switch it to dark mode so that we're actually just measuring the performance of the site and how it affects my battery. Cool. So I'm now on the site. Let me dark mode. I have my list of apps. You can see them here. I'm just going to leave this on. We're at 84% now, getting started. And we're going to check back at 30 minutes. Set a 30-minute timer.
Sorry,
Fuck, Siri sucks at. My native software on my phone is the problem more often than other stuff. Ping might be a better test. It says media, but yeah, the media is going to kill the battery because again, if I have a video playing, that's going to hurt battery, not React. And I want something that's just the React code because that's the problem here, right? I'm not even going to disable background services. I'm going to let everything else go on here. Because afterwards, I'm going to test the same thing with Astro. Set a 30-minute timer.
30 minutes counting down.
Cool. So we're going to leave this for 30 minutes. I'm at 84% right now, screenshotted. And I'm just going to leave this. And in 30 minutes, it's going to go off. We're going to record what the difference is. And I'll do it again with Astro. And my poor editor is going to have to find a way to stuff this all in the video. I am so sorry, FaZe. You'll make it work. Because this is, without question, the most bullshit argument of this entire video. Because the thing making your sites drain your battery is media playback, animation, advertising, tracking, tons of network requests. None of these things have a thing to do with web frameworks and software. React has nothing negative to do with the battery impact that we're talking about here. Insanity. My timer just went off for the 30-minute mark. and I lost 1% of my battery with my phone on a React website for 30 minutes. 1%, 30 minutes with a pretty sizable React app open. It's the Upload Thing dashboard, which is a big React app, but it doesn't have anything else. It has no ads, no media, nothing else. But React cost me 1% of my battery, at least if it wasn't my screen or the radios or all the other things. But 30 minutes, 1%, thinking React isn't the problem here. But just to confirm, I'm going to go to t3.gg, which is a site using Astro, not React. We're going to set another 30-minute timer and check on this again in a little bit. So we're at 83% right now. Set a 30-minute timer.
30 minutes.
And we'll check back in another 30 minutes. Oh, wow. Switching sites and doing all that knocked us down to 82. So we're starting at 82 for this test. We have just finished the Astro test with my homepage on Astro. My light's making it hard to see. 30 minutes. Oh, wow. My battery's at 78%. I lost twice as much battery on an Astro site as I lost on my next site. Actually, 4 times as much. I lost 1% in 30 minutes on a React site, and I lost 4% on my empty, static Astro homepage. There's a reason why. I kind of baited you. My Astro homepage has a very subtle CSS animation in the background that slowly fades in and out. And doing literally anything at all is going to cause a massive difference in what's actually using energy on your device. If you're on a static site that happens to be using React, but the code isn't really running because you're not doing anything, it's not going to magically use a bunch of battery because you chose the wrong framework. The same way, using Astro isn't going to magically save your battery. If you had a video file or photos being rendered or CSS here, that's going to use a lot more of your battery than React ever would. And the belief that JavaScript is somehow the thing killing your battery life is as delusional as thinking Astro will fix it. Because Astro, according to my test here, has 4 times worse battery performance. But it doesn't. CSS does. But for whatever reason, we don't see people saying CSS ruined the web. I digress. Back to the video, and shout out my editor FaZe for dealing with stitching these clips in, because these came in randomly throughout the rest of my stream. Whew.
And these sites just provide a worse user experience. So have you ever clicked the back button just to find out that it doesn't work like you would expect it to? That's because the back button has been hijacked by the JavaScript framework that website is using.
Yes, bad routers suck. But do you know what has way more bad routing? The piles of redirects any spam site gets. If you click something that's an ad, you go 15 redirects before you get to it. Now the back button's even more broken. Are there websites that are using things like React Router incorrectly and break the navigation stack? Yeah. I can't remember the last time I found one of those. Like, legitimately can't. Ooh, that's actually a good point, chat. It's funny saying chat in chat, but I like this framing to Steelman. You can say that his argument is interactivity ruined the web. If that's his point, if his point is that the web is for finding static things and going to static sites with static content that should all be free and easy to access, and the web's going in a direction I don't like, cool. Fine argument that we can have. If only that was the argument that was happening here.
And if they didn't implement it correctly, well, oops. And have you ever gotten caught in an infinite loading circle? Well, that's just because all of the JavaScript didn't load in. Because a lot of these frameworks, they initially load in no HTML at all, and they only load in JavaScript. And don't worry guys, because that's a feature, not a bug.
Almost every time I've seen this is because the JavaScript failed to load because of a CDN issue. Nothing to do with the issues he's bringing up here again. I am getting more and more frustrated as we go.
And if the JavaScript doesn't load in for whatever reason, well, let's not worry about that. And so that is why every website these days just feels slow and bloated and buggy. Now, a lot of people have already complained about this. I'm definitely not the first person to notice this, but as a web developer myself, I actually want to see the web become better. And there is some light at the end of the tunnel because a lot of newer tools are starting to move away from this idea that
Why do you think Astro exists? Astro exists because all of the old tools sucked so hard that making static sites was rough. And if you got used to using things like Next, React, Gatsby, all these modern tools, and then you went back to do things the old way, it was depressing and miserable. My quote that they actually used to have on the website, they might even still have it, is that Astro was the first time I didn't hate building content sites, because it was the first time that like I could use the tools and things I was familiar with and use and get all of the DX wins that we get from all this stuff while writing a website that was static. And even then, I showed earlier that the performance of the SPA React approach actually feels a lot better as an end user, even on text-based websites.
everything has to be a single page app. So some newer frameworks like Astro, which I've previously covered on this channel, They combine things like the nice developer experience of using frameworks like React while keeping the end user in mind. So you can use all of your cool JavaScript frameworks, but when the site builds, it only uses JavaScript when necessary. So it still loads in HTML and CSS like you would expect, and it only uses JavaScript when the site actually needs it to be interactive.
Do you know what else does this now? I'll give you a hint. It starts with N and ends in X. The only way you get client-side JavaScript in Next now, beyond like the core navigation bundle, which by the way, Astro does now too in order for their transitions to work. So the only way you end up loading client-side JavaScript now is if you mark a file with use client. Everyone's moving in that direction. We've figured that out. Like if we can ship HTML, we should, and if we can't, we shouldn't. But the idea that something that is focused on HTML is inherently better for all sites is a fundamental misread. And to not include the fact that what you're writing right here is JSX, by the way. You didn't know that Astro moved, I think it was version 3, they moved off of their custom templating language into JSX, because JSX is a phenomenal standard that was built largely around React and its needs that has grown to the point where whole frameworks are being built around it directly. I do wish Eric played more with Next.js and tried to better understand it before this, because,
And this is how things are supposed to be. Now, people are finally kind of waking up to this situation, and people are taking the trend of more sensible frameworks with less JavaScript shipped to the end user. And I do think it is a good thing, but I still think that
Okay, this is adorable. Can anybody see the issue that I'm pausing and geeking out over here? Because this whole thing has been about the performance of websites. Where does this image come from, and is it optimized or not? How does this image get optimized? How do we load something that is going to be way bigger than any of the JS binaries here? Well, if you're not building image optimization solutions, you're screwed. Thankfully, Astro has an Astro image component now that does a lot of these things, but you need to set this up now. This is a problem that you have to deal with. And thankfully, Astro realized, oh shit, we need to fix that. But you're literally coding a worse problem than the one you're complaining about. Imagine watching a video of a chef complaining that some other chef's kitchen is dirty, saying like, oh, did you see like there was some like splatter on the wall of some spaghetti like residue? Like, why is there sauce like here? Why are these dishes not cleaned yet? That's gross. As they're like scraping rat shit off of a bowl. It just the contrast here is killing me, because poorly optimized images are 10 times worse a problem than anything else we've talked about in this video.
Kind of going in the wrong direction, because the build process is still extremely complex and fragile. Like in Astro, this framework that I reviewed, it still needs 146 megabytes of dependencies just to build a basic hello world with Astro. So I'm still not completely sold on some of these new frameworks. Now, it should go without saying, but for simple websites that don't have a lot of interactivity, JavaScript is almost never needed. There are things like static site generators now, like Hugo, which I have covered in the past. That is still one of my favorite tools that I use to build websites. But these tools like Hugo, they have never been better, and you can build huge, complex sites quickly, and you don't have to query a database for every post like you do with something like WordPress. So for building small to medium-sized websites, this is definitely the best option, I think.
Man, Hugo's so big and bloated. I can't believe developers are installing all these dependencies. They have to install Go and set all these things up just to contribute to your site. Like, why not just use HTML? Like, it's what the browser's using anyways. Why are you adding all these unnecessary steps and dependencies? Just write in HTML. Come on.
But I think just being aware of all of the issues with the modern web is the best first step. And when you're building a new website or a new project, really ask yourself, do you need a JavaScript framework? Even if it seems like you're saving a lot of time at the beginning, you can run into a lot of issues down the line with these, especially when we're talking about performance, which can definitely impact if people actually want to use your website or not. And so before you start a new project, just ask yourself, does it need this framework? And is there any better, more efficient way to build what I'm thinking about? And so that's how I got to the current state of the web. And my dream is that someday I will be able to browse Reddit without having to crash my browser.
Yeah, Reddit sucks.
I can dream, right?
Yeah, I have so many feelings. That was a trip. Yeah, the blending of websites and web apps throughout was messy. My brain's going back. Does anybody have a link to the HTMX shitpost about how they couldn't order a pizza and they blamed me? Every time Theo says HTMX is for non-JS devs or for backend devs or focus devs, I want to pour bleach in my eyes. To be clear, I have no problem with JS, React, or Svelte on a technical level. However, I think 90% of all websites do not need to be written in React. We shouldn't tell new developers that the only way to build a website is React. Forget about programming for a second. A few nights ago, I wanted to order pizza from my favorite pizza place. When I opened their site, it took a good minute to load, and at the end, I couldn't order because I kept getting weird error messages. The developer of that website was probably a poor junior dev who was told by people like Theo that real front-end devs use React. I think about this far too often. This is the funniest thing anyone's ever said about me, possibly. They're mad that they can't order pizza, and that's my fault for pushing React. Huh? I think I'm going to leave on that note because I have nothing else to say here. Use the tools you like, ship fast, learn lessons when there's lessons to be learned. Don't shit on other people's porches without a good reason because, yeah, I wanted to go in liking this video because there's some good points to be made here about how a lot of websites have gone to total shit. And like the Reddit thing sucks. I agree. But that has nothing to do with React. This has everything to do with the way these companies are structured, the way the engineers are working, and the cultures around how these things are built in the first place. And if users really did care about these things, we'd all go move to the faster apps. If you think there's a huge disadvantage that these developers have by building things in React, you have a great opportunity. Go rebuild them in something faster, make a shitload of money, and prove all of us wrong. And until then, I'm probably going to keep using React. So until next time, peace nerds.